We have a large group that are joining us via webinar. I guess it's a day where right now we're in the calm before the storm. So I hope that having this at 10 o'clock has helped the rest of you clear your afternoon and you can get home before any of the snow starts. Again, today's webinar is one of a number of webinars that we'll do throughout 2013 with the intent to help educate each of you as fundraising professionals on certain aspects of your job and your organization to help you magnify the impact of what you do in the communities around Central Iowa and beyond. This morning I'm pleased to have, does that mean anything? All right, I'm going to keep going. We had a little interruption there. I'm pleased to have David Strege with us again this morning. We did board governance last year on one webinar, and we've had a lot of people who have asked, when are you going to do that again? When is it coming forth? So it was important to get that on the calendar. We will likely do this again late summer, early fall. So for those of you who have board members, I'll try to get those dates out to you quickly so that you can get it on their calendars as well. A lot of people confuse operating boards and governing boards. And this morning, David's going to talk about the role of a governing board and some of the things that you as fundraisers need to be aware of in relationship to board governance and creating a highly effective board of directors. So without ado, David Strege.
Good morning. And as Sue mentioned, what we're going to take you through for the Charitable Giving Resource Center is to help you understand how to have an effective board of directors. And a lot of you have been in your position for many years, and you end up getting frustrated by communication, by a lack of action by the board of directors, and also as you have sat as a board member on other organizations, you know how frustrating it is at times to be sitting there and all of a sudden you get in a discussion about what color the bathroom should be. And that ends up to be a waste of time. It is an inappropriate place for the type of board of director position we're going to talk about, but yet those discussions occur. So I'm going to take you through some education this morning on a concept for you to become familiar with, and then also provide you some references that you can continue some education on this topic. So what we look at here is as you form a board, you have to define what is the purpose and have those board members understand their roles and responsibilities. Because anytime you call something a board, whoever is sitting on it thinks they have power in that position. And they're thinking they have control. They are trying to define how much power they actually have. And so as you lay out that kind of the limits going into this is the first area you really have to start working on. And what we're going to help you understand is actually you should only have one group that's called a board. I've sat on organizations, and it's just in one organization, and we had over 10 boards. Well, it gets confusing. And actually, there was only one, what I'm going to call a governing board, that has the authority and the responsibility and actually the liability for the organization. But because people like thinking they have power, they want to be called a board member, and you end up with all these boards, you end up with confusion of who has the right, the authority over what area. So some of this is the critical first step, is understanding what is a board and actually only having one board, what I'm going to call a governing board. So as you go out and look at the purpose of boards, you can read through this list here and just think through, are there any other topics or any other responsibilities or purposes of a board or a board member? So read through this list. You know, do you get board members to help you get funds for the organization, to help understand the purpose, to give advice to the staff, connect to the stakeholders? And stakeholders is whoever participates, supports, or benefits from the organization. They have an interest in the viability of the organization. They're making sure that the financials are audited every year, good business business practices are followed, how's staff doing, how do you make sure the organization doesn't keep repeating itself. And this is a pet peeve of mine personally in organizations, is you've had the past boards do very good work, and they've made very wise decisions which have helped move this organization forward, and yet they keep rehashing or they forget that decision, and they essentially it fades away. So how do you capture that best thinking going forward and also develop marketing campaigns? So most people would say, yep, that's a pretty comprehensive list of boards, and essentially what I'm going to show you is when you talk about a governing board, most of this list is incorrect. Now, you can still need help in the organization on those topics that are blanked out or crossed out, but for a governing board, that is not its purpose. It is not to be there to raise funds. Bring in other volunteers to do that. You will always want some impact or some input into your organization. You want to fill in what's called knowledge gaps. Maybe your staff needs some expertise in an area, and you've got a volunteer very willing to help share that expertise. Bring them in as a volunteer. Bring them in as somebody that's in that role. They don't have to be a governing board member to help you. Even auditing financials. A governing board will validate funds are handled properly, but they're not doing the auditing. They're making the decision of who will be doing the auditing. So there may be an outside firm. They'll be doing spot checks. I'll give an example, a national board that I sat on, and the executive director was to develop an employee manual, make sure it was communicated and distributed, and they reported to us, yes, that was done. Well, then all of a sudden as we went to do some research and communicate on a spot check with employees of the organization, no, it had not been done. It had not been delivered to employees. And so when we went to verify, was it there? No, it wasn't, and that person no longer is employed with the organization. So you have to validate, the governing board does have to validate what's reported to them, and the financial or an audit is how they verify that, but the board itself is not doing that. Evaluating staff, it's going to sound strange, but what I'm going to take you through is a process that the governing board only directly communicates and evaluates the executive director. Whether you want to call it a chief executive officer, the primary head staff member organization, that is who is the accountable leader in the organization. That is who the board evaluates, not the rest of the staff. The executive director is the one evaluating the rest of the staff. It is their responsibility. They have the authority. So it's only the executive director, not all staff. Then the marketing campaign, again, that is the staff position. They can bring in volunteers to help them with that, but that's not the board doing it. The board can provide input if asked, but really it's better to bring in other people with other expertise. So the board is really those individuals with the ability to look at the picture, the impact of the organization on society, how do we develop the long-range view of what this organization is doing, how to accomplish that within constraints, and authorizing and hiring a CEO or executive director to do that. That's the purpose of the governing board. So as you need other organizations or other people that you're bringing in, quit calling them board members. Call them what they are. They're a working group. They're a volunteer. They're a non-paid staff member. A lot of different titles you can give them, but in these working groups, now here is where the staff would be provided the authority and the responsibility to go out and bring in those other expertise needed in those topics listed there. How do we raise funds, people to actually make the calls, do the actual solicitation of fundraising out there. Also, you're going to have people that are interested in the purpose of your organization that can help with some of the property maintenance. They have the skill set. Bring them in. you have many people that when they understand your passion of what impact you're bringing, and yet you have this need, that's where people want to help and use them for such. They don't need to be a board member to do that. Human resource policy review, as you have an employee manual, and that's a big, extensive document with a lot of Department of Labor requirements that's hard to stay up on. Well, if you have a volunteer able to help, bring them in. Also, grant request writing and management. If you have people talented to do that, great. Otherwise, you can go to organizations like the Charitable Giving Resource Center. That's one of their offerings they're able to provide. So that's some of the working groups. The other one's advisory groups. This is people that you get together on getting feedback, making sure you're not getting out of touch with what's needed out there. And this may be feedback from those benefiting from your organization, from those perceiving or seeing your messaging. If you're going to come out with a new story to tell about the benefits of your organization and what it's doing, maybe run it by some people initially to see what their reaction is. If you're coming out with new programs, new deliverables, new concepts, and you're not sure how it's going to be received, that's where some volunteers can give you the feedback, both that know your organization and also new people that can give you a new perspective of how the information is received. So this is, remember, this is now not a board. This is whatever you want to call this group, but quit using the word board in here, call them a work group or advisory group. So what's the purpose of a governing board? So what you're doing is you're going to have either the board of directors itself or stakeholders, depending on the dynamics of your organization, select the board. Typically, the main question you have to answer in your bylaws is if a board becomes rogue and has become too authoritarian and running the organization, how do they get replaced? That is really the purpose of the bylaws. Yeah, here's a normal process for selecting, electing, appointing new board members, and that can be all the way from an executive director to the board selecting itself to if you want to have a stakeholder or shareholder vote, doing that, that's fine. That we see that all three of those scenarios occur. But you have to be able to answer, if we run into problems, how do we remove board members, and the bylaws is what do that. Because what the board is about is you have to have a connection, a representation of those that have a passion about your organization, are benefiting from your organization, that we call the stakeholders. You need to have that input, that connection to those entities out there, and that's what board members are about, is providing that connection. Now also, as they have that connection, it is the big 30,000-foot view of what is this organization about, what is the purpose, what is our impact on society. And all the way from the very narrow focus, if you start getting too large and trying to do too much, that is the group that should bring the staff back, saying you're trying to be too many things to too many people. Let's hone in on our message, let's do what we do best, and that's what the board of directors is all about. So it's that connection and purpose of the organization. Now you start capturing this best thinking, and I'm going to reference a book here. It's Boards That Make a Difference, and also Reinventing Your Board, and the author is John Carver. So John Carver has written a number of books on this topic, on what's called policy governance. There's a Policy Governance Association. There's certification in that area, a number of books on this topic. And the whole concept, the whole idea behind this is as your board comes up and establishes and captures best thinking, what's the purpose of this organization, what's the limitations or boundaries on the executive director to make it happen, how does the board relate to the executive director, and how does the board manage itself. They capture that thinking in policies. the board uses policies to speak with one voice to the executive director to itself. And now, if they see something needs to change, or they're getting into discussion about a topic, it should be related to the policies. It either should be addressed in the policy, or if the board feels it needs to add a policy, that's fine. But that's its communication. That keeps its focus. That keeps you out of the discussion of what color the bathroom should be. Because you have to have that broader thinking, turn that over to property maintenance, or turn that over to a staff member on coloration or concepts there. Yes, you want to make wise decisions, but a board only has so much time together. Whether you're meeting 3 times a year, 4 times a year for a couple hours or 6 hours at a time, that is still only limited time. They are not there all the time. They won't be there as a group. They have limited times to make impactful decisions. And that's when you start running into problems recruiting board members, is when they feel they're not contributing anything. The work, the time, the energy they're putting in, if they're seeing it's having no impact or benefit to the organization, they'll say, well, I'm done. You know, even if I would have an interest later on, I don't want to come back. This was a bad experience. And that's what you're trying to avoid. You would rather have, instead of a struggle to find good board members, imagine if you had to actually be selective and say, well, now I've got so many, I've got to look for the best people to fill what we need. So it's all about impact. It's all about keeping the board focused, and that's what capturing policies is. The policies, that's what the board members have in front of them, reference, utilize, keep it active, keep it alive at every meeting. That's their main document. Then the governing board also is going to do the formal review, the feedback to the executive director. Now, there's times this will be adversarial, but it should be a positive mentoring experience where the board can say, here's our observations, here's the measurements. And the measurements are the ends. And that's what the whole purpose of the organization is, measured by what? What are you trying to do as an organization? What can you measure? Because there's some benefits you're providing that can't be measured. And you just have to do it from observation of the board members. So you want to try to capture that to say, here's what we're trying to accomplish. How did you do towards that goal? Did you violate any of the parameters we set on you? Did you bankrupt us? Did you do something unethical? Did you treat employees poorly? Those are the limitations that now the executive director, if the board sets this up, should have freedom. It's a very freeing experience for them because now they know the board has captured in writing in one voice, here's what we expect of you, executive director. Now just imagine that. Instead of trying to please however many you have on your board, 10 people, 12 people, or if you have 6 boards, 52 people, the ideal size of a board typically is going to be about 5 to 11. You start getting too small and you start losing some voice, again, exposure to stakeholders, you get too many and it becomes an unmanageable number. So that 5 to 11, 7 tends to come out as an ideal number. So you set up in the policy governance what we're trying to accomplish, how do we measure it, what's the limitations, and now we do the evaluation. And that determines that the board is the one working with the executive director on the compensation, on any additional benefit packages, specifically for the director. The director is setting the compensation philosophy for the rest of the staff. So that's what some of the primary purposes of the board is. So the policy governance that I've talked about, and again, this is captured through John Carver. You'll see many variations of this. John Carver applies this in a very pure and true method. And so if you want to look at that approach, he's the one that has come up with this. So policy governance categories, as I talked about, you have ends. And the end side of it, what you're doing is that is the purpose of the organization. That is what we want to see happen, the benefits to society, what benefit to whom for what cost. That's typically what you'll see it as a vision statement, a mission statement, but then the measurable goals to keep advancing towards that purpose. Executive limitations then is where you set the parameters on the executive director of what not to violate, and we'll cover that in more detail. So let's take you into ends. So as you look at ends, and this is the work that most boards avoid. This is the hardest work, but this is the most critical work. So as you look at ends, you have a couple of what you see this horizontal line in the middle. And above that line is the values, the governance, really what the board is about in relation to your organization. Now you have the top line is the grantors, and this is, you'll hear this called the shareholders, but nonprofits don't have shareholders typically. So I'm going to use a different word with the grantors. The grantors are the ones that kind of form the organization, or those that will always have a passion for what you're doing. No matter what, they're going to stand by you. They're there for you. If you have to call on somebody to get something done, that's your people. Those are the ones engaged in your organization and its purpose. And so if you wanted the feedback from a group of who should be on the board, that is probably your primary group. Because if you lose their passion, if you disengage them, you lose some of the resources of your organization. Whether it's monetarily or time or energy or connections or relationships, the grantors is the ones you really need. So now you have your board. The board with the feedback from all these stakeholders. It can be government organizations, beneficiaries of your organization, those that have impact, whether it's revenue sources, those that you connect with, have relationships with, whether they're people. That's a broad list. But you get feedback from all those groups of what are we about. What is the purpose, or what's here is called values of the organization, and you're going to define what we're trying to accomplish. What's the measurable goal that we have here. So that's the end side of this. Now, the board, as you see, you get below the line. That horizontal line there, the board's connection to the organization is officially through the CEO. The CEO is taking this, understanding this, the values in the end, and turning it into operations. So now they are the ones hiring the staff. They're the ones that are getting the staff to have the benefits to society through the beneficiaries at the end. So they're setting up how do we operate, how do we receive funds, how do we determine how to expend funds, what are the short-term tactics to help meet the objectives, to meet the goals as defined by the board in the ends and the values of the organization. So this is what ends are all about, all the way from the broad vision statements, mission statements, but you have to define very specifically who is to benefit, who are you going to benefit in what manner. And that's what the board's all about. And to be honest, that's 2 or 3 day discussion. That's the hardest discussion a board should have, because you need to get all that outside input, all those lines from the stakeholders. It's what we call environmental input. What's going on in our society, in our community, that we can make a difference. Once you identify that, and is that something that is in the purpose of your organization, and you define that, and now your staff can turn that into impactful stories that evoke emotion, that's where your organization gains traction. It's all right here. Everything else we're going to talk about is just people rules. It's just people managing people, but it's this ends and defining ends and the story behind this. Here's where your organization makes a difference. And if you haven't done this, you've got to go and do this and spend the needed time here. And everybody will avoid this at all costs because it's hard. So this is just some of the definitions. Again, when we talked about the grantors, those that determine why the organization exists and for what benefit. They're there for the long haul. The beneficiaries are the ones that benefit from your group, and you have to check with them to make sure they're getting what they want, and they're going to be there as long as that need exists. I haven't found too many organizations, but just imagine if the needs you were there to solve in society was solved and those beneficiaries were taken care of and didn't have that need. Isn't that the ultimate purpose? Sounds strange, but really you want to get to the point where you've really solved the issue. And so you're bringing value to society for a specific group. So the board is focusing on the grantors and the environmental input, and then really your staff is focusing on the beneficiaries. Grantors value the organization, beneficiary want things from it. So this has just helped define that. Who cares enough to support the organization regardless of personal benefit? Why does it exist? Who's better off or intended to be better off from benefits received from it? And then who else is concerned about the organization, societal, the value to society, but not necessarily the organization itself. That's all those grantors, beneficiaries, and stakeholders that you need to get input into how your organization should benefit society. So the stakeholder linkage is, again, to help understand the value structure, to have that input in there. You cannot operate in a vacuum. Our life keeps changing too much. You have to stay up with what's going on. And then learning about, is the need being met appropriately? Are there improvements we can make along the way? So that was end. That's the critical end, the side of it. It's hard work for a board and your executive director, but it's work you must do. So let's go into executive limitations. And this is now just people managing people. And so what you're doing here, and this is just kind of the schematic, is most boards will easily gravitate towards this. Most of your board members are good administrative people or business owners. They've been successful, and they've done this because they know how to develop a good organization. And they do that by setting pretty good rules and administrative limitations. And so the challenge here is focus on the ends, and then in this side of executive limitations, just have general rules to start out with. So again, my example, don't bankrupt the organization. Treat people fairly. Don't do anything illegal. So those are broad statements, but the board says they are hiring an executive director that will interpret those rules and observe those rules by most reasonable person's interpretations. As the board gets uncomfortable and they say, okay, don't bankrupt the organization, that's a pretty broad statement, but actually we would want to make sure you don't take out a loan more than $100,000 without board approval. That's an example now where the board starts constraining that even further. And so, and what can happen, and where a board has to be very careful, is they have to feel comfortable. So you got this global level. Level 1, don't bankrupt the organization. Level 2, if you're going to take out a loan more than $100,000, get board approval. Number 3, it can be the point, well, every check that's signed, let's make sure you have 3 people signing every check. Well, you get to the point the board can get so burdensome on the organization, it's defeating the purpose. And they need to go back to spend more time on ends and quit working so much on executive limitations. Now, they want to validate the work here. Every limitation they set up, they want to be able to validate it's getting done, either in belief in a statement from the executive director, or in my example, doing a financial audit, or another example of, well, can you just show us that you actually have health insurance in place for the employees? Just show us the contract. I mean, some of those things are easy to validate, but a board never thinks to ask for those things. It's a quick, yep, here it is, here's the paper, great, great work, let's proceed. So the board this is just the limitations of how do you have a reasonable business and efficient business limitations put on the director, because all the other decisions, is in the prerogative of the executive director. All their other decisions. So here's where we're headed. Here's the barriers put on you, executive director. All the other decisions are yours and the staff to determine. Now, we're here for input as a board of directors, or if you have other advisory groups, that's great. But don't get too extensive and too deep on this, because otherwise you're back to the old, well, in the policies on property maintenance, all bathrooms should be pink instead of blue because we don't want to keep making this decision every meeting. Okay? So that's the challenge you have to get into in policy governance. So here's the mistakes to avoid as a board. The first one is focus on ends, not the means. The governing board is all about what are we trying to accomplish. As long as it's being accomplished within the boundaries, within the limitations the board prescribes, fine, we're happy. But if they're saying, well, you know, we think it would be better to hold the annual fundraiser in October instead of September because our big state rivalry game is in September or in October, you're starting to meddle. The means is the staff work. That's the responsibility of the staff. Let them work on the means. And we would jokingly actually have a sign in our board meetings that if we got into means discussions of trying to dictate means to staff, we would hold up a sign saying, you're talking about means. That's staff's role. Unless we're in a policy governance discussion about it, writing a new limitation, let's not go there. That's staff. So again, remember this is governing board. Focus on the big picture, what we're trying to accomplish. Again, as I talked about, they avoid ends. They rarely get back to it. Once they've written it, they'll quick do it. Well, that vision and mission ends. That sounds good. Because they don't want to spend the time, because it is the hardest work to do. And then they'll spend too much time on the limitations, putting more and more constraints, getting these policies so extensive, they become too burdensome, and everybody stops using it. You should be able to have, normally about 10 to 15 pages of policies on all these topics. You're not going to have the employee manual in the board policies. You're just going to have a policy that executive director, you're required to have an approved and accepted employee policy manual. That's all you need to do. The board validates it's been done, and it's in place. So, but they'll get too, and that's where you get too long. They stop being utilized. Every board meeting, every person should have a copy of the policies. That's what they readily reference. Because if a new topic comes up, one, is this even a board decision? Is this for board discussion? Two, has it already been handled in policies? If it has been, do we agree with the policy as drafted? Great, we've got their answer. If it hasn't been addressed or we disagree with the policy, now the board can have valid discussions to change the policy or add one. Also, being able to establish what we want to measure. The board is always, the governing board is always in, we want to know everything. But they really need to start defining what they need to know. And, okay, they go through financials. Okay, what are you looking for in financials? Why are you asking me, are we using Office Max or Office Depot where we buy our paper? What difference does that make? What are you really looking for in asking such minute questions from a board member? Well, you know, they're just trying to make sure they seem like they're productive, but they're dealing in areas that make no sense for a board member. That's really a chief financial officer concern. Let them worry about where to get the best value for the money. So when you're getting into that board member, if they can focus on and say, here's what we want reported. An effective organization, I can tell you in 3 pages of graphs, I know everything about my organization I need to know, and I can determine and evaluate it in 5 minutes. That's my goals, that's the limitations. For the major measurables I'm concerned about to make sure I'm doing my fiduciary responsibility as a board member. 3 pages, 5 minutes, I know we're on track. Now we can get back to what's our impact in society, are there tweaks in our policies we need to amend or change, and evaluation of the executive director. That's all the time we have for it. We can't get into all this, let's evaluate every number in the financial statement. That's not the purpose of the board. They want to be fiduciary responsible. But what's the key numbers? Do we have adequate cash flow? Are we taking on too much debt? Can we make payroll? And a few numbers, you can determine that trend very quickly without going through all the financials. Yeah, you can have a bookkeeper, an audit committee, make sure the numbers are valid, but that's just a validation to the board. So you got to be careful with, if you do go to policy governance, letting it get too large, letting it become abused in it also. I mean, there's ways that I've seen executive directors abuse it also, getting too much control, but used correctly, it's very useful. And I've seen organizations grow dramatically, all the way from national boards I've been on to local groups that have implemented this, and it now wiser decisions are made, a sharper focus of the organization, and growth, it just takes off. So board executive relationship, and really this is just establishing for each end established by the board and each limitation what they look at. What they look at and how they're doing, how the organization doing reflects how the director's doing. So all the policies we write on ends and limitations is now what we use to evaluate the director. We typically have a director report, give their feedback, whether it's once a year or quarterly, however often the board wants to do this, of here's the policy, here's my opinion as a director is how I interpret it and how I'm trying to implement this, and whether or not, as the executive director, I felt I met this objective, either the end or observe the limitation. So if the director says, yep, here's my interpretation, the board has to answer, do we agree with that interpretation? Do we have a need to communicate more between the board, further refining the end or the purpose and policy? Because again, you want to speak with one voice as a board to your director, and you do that through policy. Or if we agree with the interpretation, great. If not, let's communicate more to refine it further. Does that interpretation represent the value the board was trying to capture? Again, yes or no. It tells the board it has to work on the policies more if something's missing. Would the type of data named give you adequate evidence? So again, they may pull on how many people they've benefited, some quick results on cash flow of the entity, of the organization. Is there any other data the board needs or needs to validate to be comfortable with the report, and does it show compliance? Because now it's just, yes, we feel that the executive director is doing what they're doing. Now it's a discussion about compensation and benefits, or if we have a bunch of no's, now we have a harder decision, do we need to replace the executive director? But now we have an ongoing dialogue, whether it's quarterly or at least annually, of director, how you doing? Here's areas you could improve, or else we have to go on to a different person. And then the last one is the board process, and this is typically how boards elect themselves, how they run their meetings. If you're going to use, the typical board governance structure meetings, most boards have kind of gone away from that, so you don't see that as often. And a couple of resources, if you're a chairman of the board, and I'm going to mention a couple more books here. One is I've talked about John Carver, C-A-R-V-E-R, and he's got a number of books out on policy governance. A shorter book, and this one was specifically written for religious organizations, but it takes some of the concepts from policy governance, kind of brings it out in a shorter version. It's called Winning on Purpose. And Winning on Purpose is written by John Kaiser, K-A-I-S-E-R. So John Kaiser, Winning on Purpose. It's kind of a shorter version to help understand this. And then two other, what I'll call business books or meeting books. One is called traction, like entire traction, which we'll need probably tonight with the snow, written by Gino Wickman, G-I-N-O, Wickman. And traction is an overall business approach philosophy. And then the last one, which ties into boards and ties into being an effective chairman, is an approach. Both traction lays out a meeting agenda format, which will be probably revolutionary for most of you. And it's really the reporting I talked about. You should be able to have a report of how the organization's doing in probably 5 to 15 minutes. 5 to 15 minutes. And when you look at your agenda, you're probably spending hours going through that. 5 to 15 minutes, how's the organization doing towards its goals and within its limitations? Now, if a discussion comes up, boy, we've got a financial problem, or we need to do some major fundraising, now that topic can come up, and you capture it into what traction talks about as an IDS discussion. Identify, discuss, and solve. You put that in a topical area that now the board or those in the meeting prioritize and talk through and solve for the rest of the meeting. Those that are the top priority. Because what tends to come up is a problem is identified in the reporting, and you start down a rabbit trail on that discussion when it may not be the most critical thing you need to address by a board or by those in the meeting at that time. There may be a person that can just take on the project and handle it. And you don't have to have a big discussion. You don't need to waste the time. Also, everybody in the meeting is determining the prioritization of what we talk about that is identified as something we need to solve. And where that comes, it's also talked about in traction, and it also comes from a book called Death by Meeting. And Lencioni, L-E-N-C-I-O-N-I, Death by Meeting. Lencioni, Patrick Lencioni, talks about using that structure also to make sure your meeting time is best used. And that because you want, as your organization, you want that time being used to provide the biggest benefit. That's what you're really looking for. And also those board members want to have that impact. They're there, they're engaged, they have a passion for your organization. Let's make sure their best thinking is captured and can be implemented by the staff. So a board member to help organize those board meetings is a couple weeks before the board meeting, the draft agenda's out, 1 week before the board meeting, a final agenda, and the reports are sent out so they can digest it. And this agenda, and this has changed now. This is the old format we used to use quite a bit. And what we're changing to is boards that I serve on is having some of this brief, what I call a dashboard or scorecard reporting, graphical presentations in 5 to 15 minutes, and the board members should understand everything that's going on. They understand everything going on. They identify issues we need to talk about, which again, the primary one that should always trump everything else is what's the purpose of our organization? Is there input or events in society that's changing that thinking? If so, do we change the purpose of our organization? Which is a big, tough decision, or do we need to focus even finer into a specific area? What are the stories? How can we relate the impact we're having on society? We always lay out those priorities of what we're going to talk about at a meeting. And then at the end, you capture who's going to do what by when. Is there things that the board's going to do, the staff's going to do going forward? So that's the references. A couple of, this is just some websites. This is mostly from John Carver's work on policy governance. His site on policy governance, and you can access there, you can write that down, and also on the Policy Governance Association. As you have people that want to become further trained, become certified, or you want to find a certified person in that area, those are available there. So the next steps hopefully you've got some understanding of how to have more effective boards. And what we'll look at is now, if this is an area of interest, now what you do is you go out and learn more about this, decide if this is something your organization wants to implement, and you have to be honest with yourself. Have a frank discussion with staff and your board. Do you feel this board is doing the best it can, or do we need to look at a way to restructure it? If everybody agrees we do, this is the type of approach to look at, and the board needs to buy in, because now it's going to take additional time, energy, and resources to make the transition. That's going to occur. You're doubling up the work for a time period to make this evolution, this change. Now you develop more refined ends, limitations, essentially those policies I talked about. How does it get reported? In developing a new role and relationship between the governing board and the CEO. And it may be renaming all your other working groups. As I mentioned, I've been on groups with too many boards, and they all thought they had power. And what I always come back to is who has the right to hire and fire the CEO. That's who has the power. The other ones are providing advice and input. And then how will they operate, the connections, and how you develop those connections. And that's where creativity can come in, and then keep evaluating, revising these policies with now a new living document you use going forward, and then evaluate how it's working for you going forward. So it's a lot of information. I'm going to take you back just to the previous page on the website in case you didn't get that. And so that's there's a lot of information out there. We've got a little bit of time left. If you want to type in questions, Sue, do you have any other directions that you want to share?
Now, just as a reminder to all of you, you will get a copy of this presentation tomorrow. Our marketing person, Gina David, will send that out to everybody so that you have something to correlate with your notes. I'm sure that there are some of you who are sitting there thinking, gosh, I don't know if this is for me. It's not for everybody. Some of you have to have an operating board. But with an operating board, you can integrate many of the governing board traits to make sure that you are being as effective as you possibly can. David is right, and many of you were probably shaking your head when you think about what things are your board members attempting to be involved in. Is that the right involvement at the right time? So whether you decide to move forward with a governing board role and process, keep in mind that it may not be for all of you, and that even if you don't go that direction, there are many things in this presentation today that can help you run a much more effective board meeting, and organization. So if anybody has questions, again, you can type those in. We'll take a look at them. I thank all of you for coming out this morning and taking the time to listen to this presentation. Your board really is one of your biggest assets, or should be one of the biggest assets that you have. So learning how to work with them and for them so that the value add is at both ends. They should be getting value from you. You should be getting value from them. That's a very important thing to remember. We'll wait just a second here to see if anybody has questions. If not, be safe this afternoon. While we were talking, I had a couple quick alerts that came through that some of the schools in the area are closing after lunch. So please be careful on the roadways today and this weekend. Oh, looks like we have one question. Can I see it all the way? So it says, what is the biggest board pitfall that you have recently witnessed? David, do you want to answer that?
Well, there's two things I'll talk about. One is for a lot of boards, they love digging into minutia. And as I talked about, even with policy governance, and they start listing these limitations, they start getting them so minute and dealing with such minor issues that it's not appropriate. And it handcuffs the directors. And an example, and the reason I talk about that so much is the person we want accountable. the accountable leader for running the organization is the executive director. That's who we are really evaluating. That's who's running the organization. If the board takes that away, guess what? The board's accountable to itself. And it's hard to evaluate and criticize and fire non-paid volunteers. I mean, you start losing that impact. So that's the board wanting to dig so deep into minutia instead of just quickly validating. Here's what we want to know. Here's why we want to know it. Let's validate it. Let's move on to better topics. The other one, and I've got this going on in 2 groups right now, and what it deals with is a group, the organization not wanting to make a change like this. And the reason is they have all these volunteers, and they have all these volunteers that are essentially running the organization. And that sounds like it's a good thing, but it's taken away all the power from the executive director. The executive director or the senior person essentially can't bring this all in because they don't have the authority. They have the authority in title, but they've formed all these volunteer groups that the board has authorized and given those groups the ability to make these decisions, and yet not the ability for the executive director to override that. And I'm seeing that more and more, and the problem is when you have everybody accountable, nobody's accountable. So, and that's from that book, Winning on Purpose. It really lays out that concept well, that you have to have one primary accountable leader. There's many other books on that topic also, and it's giving that when they have the responsibility, they also have to have the authority to make those decisions. So that's my observation or answer to that question.
I'm working with a nonprofit right now that is having some issues with that. They have a very affluential and influential board, and they also have 2 full-time people on their staff. And there are individuals on the board who have some really wonderful ideas and directions that they want the group to take, and they're losing focus on what they started out to be. And as David said early in the conversation, you can't be everything to everybody. You have to figure out what is your one main goal, and that should be the only thing you look at down the road. How do you get to that? How do you achieve success in that area? So if you see that your board is starting to dilute the kinds of impact you're having within your programs, you've got some problems. And they've got to start allowing that executive director, again, as David had said, they have not only the responsibility but the authority to take care of some of the issues that they see are occurring. That's a big pitfall in nonprofits, are very well-meaning board members who you come at the beginning of a board meeting and you think you know what's on your plate to do, and all of a sudden they have all these other ideas and you're running ragged trying to figure out what to do. So very important. We've got one more question here. Are there tools to use that separate board members' personal feelings from their board role? Is an investment policy for their endowment or other funds?
Well, the tool, and that's where the policy governance really works well, because when you're a governing board member and you take them through an orientation, they understand that they are drafting a policy, and the policy is the voice of the board. And so in the board discussion, their opinions can come up. They can express their opinions. We have a valid debate. Death by meeting actually talks about having heated discussions, which all of us nice Midwesterners don't have that as much of a very volatile discussion. But you have the honest, clear communication on a topic. The board votes on it, and that's captured as policy, and you leave the meeting all behind that policy, even when you voted against it. And if you don't, you leave the board. And so you've got to be, have your presentation, discuss it, go out with it. And so when different opinions matter, You've captured the one voice. The executive director is going to implement it. And you can disagree with the executive director, but if they're not violating policy and they're accomplishing the ends, they're doing what you want them to do. So it was talking about specifically investment policy statement. Well, you may develop working groups, and so at times the board is just going to say, do a prudent man rule to effectively manage the investments of the endowment of the organization. That's all you're probably going to address in the policy manual. And you're going to put a limitation that make sure that we're going to have withdrawal from the endowment of a spend down of 4% a year of the value. You know, and the rest is really authorized to your executive director to form an investment committee that monitors and evaluates the investment policy statement, the investment of the endowment committee, but it's, guess what, it's your executive director's authority and responsibility to get that investment committee, make sure it meets, make sure it's doing the proper work. They don't have the expertise to do it, and your executive director, so they're going to bring in the professionals, the volunteers that have the knowledge to establish a good approach in that area. So that's the tool. That's how, hopefully that's an understandable explanation of how policy governance with written policies, you speak with one voice as a board, the executive director is going to bring in the volunteers or paid staff or consultants to handle the rest of the work.
It's important that not only your executive director and nonprofit staff, but your board members as well have a clear understanding of what their roles and responsibilities are. I work with a number of nonprofits who go, boy, I tell you, from one end to the next. Some have really good job descriptions for their staff and board member task descriptions, you know, kind of laying out what they are supposed to do. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum where there's not even a board introduction to the nonprofit, an orientation that helps them better understand where have you been, where are you now, where do you want to go. So it's important, again, that your board understand what your expectations are of them and what are their roles and responsibilities. I would encourage all of you to make sure that you sit down with each board member at least once a year and go over that. I have a template of something I call a board member contract that lets them know how many meetings they need to come to each year, what kinds of things they're responsible for doing for you and your organization. I go back to something I said earlier. What's in it for that board member and what's in it for you? If that's not a two-way door, then something's wrong. We've got one more question up here.
And this is how, can you give some examples of how a stakeholder connection works? And this is kind of a fun area, actually, of board work, because this is how, however creative as you want to get. It's really working on thinking all the connections, all the relationships, what's called a kind of a web, a relationship web occurs. What are those? And it can be, you know, obviously it's board members, it's donors, it's those that you benefit. I mean, so it's creating this list of every possible connection, every stakeholder out there. Now you also expand beyond that, and that's government entities or other groups. You know, maybe it's United Way. Maybe you're connected to United Way. That's a stakeholder out there, and it's a huge list. Now you start looking at, from that list, how do you get feedback? And it can be small interest groups. It can be written surveys. It can be, you know, these whatever the monkey survey is out there. You send out, but you actively solicit input and thoughts. And so if somebody is using your service, a beneficiary is using your services, do you have an exit survey? How did we do? What are your thoughts? Is there something we could have done better? That's one example of input from the environment. Also, you can have staff members or volunteers that just love huge esoteric thinking. So maybe they're reading publications or articles outside your normal realm that you see is going to have an impact on your organization. all the way from government laws to maybe it's an environmental issue, maybe it's a society issue, maybe it's the demographics of our society and aging, maybe it's human relationship issues, the development of technology. You start seeing how all this comes in, and the role of the board is to start filtering out the noise of what's going to impact the society impact you're having. Is there something you need to adapt to? So it's all the way from actual hands-on input, those that are actually touching and feeling the benefits of your organization, to those putting into it, like your donors. The donors are glad to share a voice with you if you're actively seeking donations, to other outside thinking, because that's how you refine your message.
It's interesting that that question was brought up, because just today I had that question brought up by a nonprofit I'm working with, and they looked at their stakeholders as being only those people who made financial contributions to them. And I said, let's step back and think about that. You are a social service providing service to the young people of your community, and you're utilizing at least a half a dozen other nonprofit services to help those children. So even though those nonprofits don't give you any money every year, those are stakeholders in what you're doing and how you're providing your service. So make sure that you're thinking very open-minded and broadly about that stakeholder term, because it's not as finite as what I believe some nonprofits think that that is. Anybody who touches the people you touch every day could potentially be your stakeholders. Very good questions. All right. With that, I think we're going to call it a morning. Watch for the next webinar details to come out. We've got some exciting things coming down the pike. There's one that I would strongly encourage all of you participating in, and it's by a group called Green Standards. And you'll notice in the description of that it says if it's too good to be true, it is. This group is somebody I became connected to a couple of years ago. They called me and I thought, okay, yeah, what's in it for you? But in the end, it really was a legitimate help for nonprofits. So I want to make sure you know who they are, what they do, and if they call you, you take their phone call. So I look forward to seeing all of your names on the list for that particular webinar. Again, have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and I will talk to you soon.